Good morning and welcome to the IATA webinar on OneRecord Insights. This session is going to be about the OneRecord API. We're going to look at key features, lots of other stuff, and a live demo as well. So let's get started. Today's speakers are Andra, Blaj, who is our OneRecord developer, and myself, Henk Mulder. I'm the head of digital cargo. This webinar is actually part of a series of 6. This is the 4th webinar. We already had 3 before, which the recordings you can all see. If you're registered for this webinar, then you'd find that the previous webinars are also in your Outlook calendar on the dates that you can see here on the screen. And so if you want to watch them, if you hadn't seen them, just go into your Outlook and you'll find the links there. They're also on our website for that matter. So if you can't find them in your Outlook, you just go to our website and you see all the links there. So this one is on the API, as I said. Next week is going to be about the data security part of it. And the last one is about pilot testing with our cargo community. So I strongly encourage you to follow those as well. So today, as I said, it's going to be about the API. We're going to really deep dive into all the various aspects of that, because an API is much more than just 3 letters. It's certainly a word you've heard a lot, but what does it really mean? By the time you finish this session, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to actually implement the API for OneRecord and start running your own services, which is really exciting, and all the information that you need for that is going to be presented today. And of course, we will make the presentation available as well, so you can also look at it afterwards. Okay, so what are we going to look at when we're talking about key features here? The first thing is, let's look at where this fits. What's the context of the API in the OneRecord story? Okay, there's lots of other elements in there. API, where does it fit? Then we'll look at the basics. Okay, when we talk about API, generally, we only talk about the basics. So we'll start with that. But then we're going to look at some of the more advanced features. For example, about the pub/sub implementation, how we delegate API access to third parties, how we handle events, very important part, how we manage access control. Then we have a story about versioning using the Memento protocol, and then we'll do a demo. At the very end, we'll leave some time for questions and answers. I'm sure there will be quite a few of them. But actually, as you'll see, most of them will answer during this session. So in any case, if you have questions and answers, just put them onto the Q&A tab and you will be able to put them in there, and then we'll answer them afterwards, myself and Andra. Okay? You can only hear us because we are presenters. This is a webinar and your microphones will not work. Okay, so there's no point trying. You can talk if you want, but we won't hear you. Use the question box for interaction. Just type in the chat box anytime, and then when we get to the Q&A, we'll pick them out and answer as many as possible. We're actually recording this session as well to make it available for other people or for yourself if you want to watch it afterwards or if you want to share it with your colleagues. So hopefully you're okay with that. So let's get started. What's the context? The essence of OneRecord is that we want to move away from a peer-to-peer messaging model to a data sharing model relying on a virtual shipment record. So what do we mean by that? As you probably know, the current system that is being used in the air freight business is a peer-to-peer model where one party passes on the information to the next party, sharing electronic documents with the next party downstream, and essentially it's a sequential process. There's a bit of back and forth, but that's what it is. Of course, the issue here is, as you can imagine, that if one of the parties doesn't pass on the information, the chain breaks. The other issue is that if one party makes mistakes in the data they pass on, downstream, everybody has the same mistakes, which then needs to be fixed downstream. We're moving away from this. We're moving to a data sharing environment where we have the same parties, but instead of them connected sequentially, they're all connected together in an environment where data can be shared, using what we call virtual shipment record. It's essentially all of the data that relates to the shipment is now available online to any party that needs it, and of course it has access to it. So it means that even if parties don't share with each other, they can still see the data that any other party has provided. So this is a huge improvement, and that's really how most businesses operate these days. So it's really just a way of moving forward. OneRecord is built on 3 pillars. First one is data. Second one is API, and the third one is security. On the data side, we've already had some webinars on our data model and on ontology and how you make that work, semantic web, all of that stuff. Okay, the whole story about data behind it. This session is about API, which is how we actually share the data using web technology. And then the next session next week is going to be on security, which is how do we make sure that only authorized parties can see this. Okay, so if you have questions around that, make sure you're there next week. But today we're going to focus on the API, which is really about how we share the data. Okay, so let's dive into that. Before we can do that, we need to look at what is the Internet of Logistics. Okay, this is something we've talked about a lot, and essentially our API is what creates the Internet of Logistics. In the same way that an ordinary web API has created the Internet, the web, if you want, Internet of Logistics is essentially based around the API, where all parties can exchange data, whether they're shippers or forwarders or DHAs, you name it, with each other through the Internet. We've just added the word logistics because our API restricts it to logistics and transport companies. Other than that, it's just the Internet. Okay, it's as simple as that. So one of the takeaways that you really should remove from this session today, when you walk away and you go back to your office and you think, what do we do? Is that the API is just really a way of communicating via the Internet. It's all it is. Okay, it's not more complicated. If you wanted to, you could fiddle around this afternoon or any other day when you have a bit of time and implement one record on your laptop or any other server. It won't take you that long. All the stuff is there. You can just deploy it and it would work. So big takeaway is that it's simple. It's as simple as the Internet. When we talk about API, it's a very loaded word. It's used by many people and it doesn't always mean the same thing. So let's define it. An API, and I'm going to read this out just to be clear for you. An API is a computing interface which defines interactions between multiple software intermediaries. It defines the kinds of calls or requests that can be made, how to make them, the data formats that should be used, and the conventions to follow. Okay? So this is a comprehensive definition of an API. In common language, API means a way of connecting, but it's not enough for us. We need to go a bit deeper than that. And here you are, here you have a definition that we've used. What features are we talking about when we talk about the One Record API? Let's get some help from Jane and John. They are our Internet of Logistics partners. Here's Jane, here's John, and they're going to help us work through this API. Because when we say API, there's a lot of questions that come up. And every time I make a presentation on this, we answer one question and we get 3 more questions, okay? So let's be very clear about this. And we're going to spend a bit of time on this. And I suggest you look at this carefully. Because if the question that you have isn't there, please type it in the Q&A box, in the chat box, because we want to be able to answer it. So, first question, how do I make my data available? Fundamental question. How can I access that data? How do I make a change request? How can I update the data? How can I save the history of the data? How do I have access to my partners? How can we automate data notifications? How can I send events related to that data? How can I define whom I give the data access? How can I take a snapshot of this data? How can I retrieve a version of the data at a certain moment in time? How can I see all of the existing versions of the data? These are the questions we have received all along the time we've been developing. But if you have another question, please put it in the Q&A box, because A, we want to answer it, and B, want to be able to add it to this presentation for the next time. Okay? But these questions here are the ones we've heard before, and we're going to answer each and one of them during this presentation. Let's start with the basics. What are the API basics? First question, how do I make my data available? This all starts with the very basic HTTP command post. We talk about logistics objects, which are really just data objects that contain information about some logistics or transport element. We call it a logistics object because that's what it is. It's a data object. When creating a new data object or logistics object on a One Record server, we use the HTTPS post request. This is the traditional use way of post. You do a post, you include the logistics object in the body, it gets created on the server, okay? So included in the request body, and provided that you are authorized and authenticated, the server will accept this request and create a logistics object. You'll hear me say a lot this business about authenticated and authorized. It's a bit like the small print in this story. You can only do anything if you're authorized and authenticated. Okay, so to some extent, we have to assume that you have an identity. All of that we'll talk about next week, but today we're going to repeat it time and time again. It's basic HTTPS, but you still need to be authorized and authenticated. Okay. Typically, you can only do that if you're the owner of the data and if you control the server as well. Now, there are scenarios where it's not your server, you can still use the post. This is a specific case, but on the whole, we assume that you have the authority to do this. So now the data is there. We have a logistics object with data about logistics and transport. How do I access the data? Nothing is easier than that. You just use the GET, HTTPS GET. You call the URI that you have about this data. In other words, you know where the data is. You have the URI, the URL if you prefer. You do an HTTPS request, and in the response body, you will get a JSON LD response, which is the standard response format that we have used. Okay? As simple as that. Not much more to say about that. Let's move on to the next type, which is the patch. And I'm just going to do a persona change. Just be back in a second.
So hi, I'm Andra, Blaj, a developer for OneRecord. Continuing on what Henk has started to present. So let's talk about patch. What is a patch? The patch basically shows, it's a description of the differences between two states of a resource. In OneRecord, we have chosen to use HTTP patch and not a put. For example, we have had a lot of this question before because we do not want to replace the whole logistics object. We just want to patch new information to it or to replace some information that we are willing to change. Okay, so in OneRecord, a client or a consumer can do change requests via patch, which basically represents an array of objects. And this array of objects contains a single operations to be applied to the logistics objects, which are add or delete. I'm going to go a little bit more in detail briefly. So it's as simple as that. The owner receives this kind of change request and then applies these operations of delete and add one by one until all the operations are applied or the entire patch fails. For example, if we see in this small example on the right side, we have, let's say, a logistics object, and we want to change the total piece and ULD count element from 10 to 11 and add a new field, which is a date. For that, we need to add an operation which is delete, like delete the old value of 10. Then we need to add an operation of add, which is add a new value of 11. And then we want to add a new field, which is date. Okay, so it's as simple as that. Again, it's a simple array of objects of delete and add, which specify the path of the element to be changed and the new value. So yes, here in this new slide, we have a small JSON snapshot of how does this operation array of objects looks like. So basically, again, we can see that we have three elements. The first one is delete, like delete the value of 10. We specify the path of the element to delete, the old value and the data type, which was decimal in our example. And then we have to add one for the new value, which is 11, and again, one for the data, which is of data type date. Okay. So add has a very simple function. It always adds new set of statements. If a pre-existing statement exists with similar or the same characteristics, it must not be overwritten. To override, a delete and an add operation must be performed. And the delete operation, it's really straightforward. It always removes sets of statements. Okay. Okay, now that we are always applying these kind of operations of delete and add, we get to the next question is, how can I save the history of data? Because if we have so many changes that are applying, how do I know what happened, who has requested which change, what was the state of the logistics object on a revision? So for that, we have developed what we call an audit trail, which is basically a history of all the change requests that were applied on a logistics object. They are stored on the backend of the OneRecord server, and they can be retrieved at any moment from a dedicated endpoint on the OneRecord API. So basically, in order to retrieve this audit trail, you just need to do a GET request on the URL of the logistics object /audit trail. Okay, so it's a very specific endpoint for that. On the right side of the slide, you can have an idea. It's a bit, well, it's a lot of information, but you can have an idea of what this audit trail contains. So basically, it contains the initial content of the logistics object. Then it contains the reference, like the URI on which you can retrieve the logistics object, and then an array of change requests together with a timestamp, the company ID, meaning the client or consumer who has requested the change request, and then a status. For example, it can be accepted, rejected, pending, etc. So if you want to reconstruct a revision of the logistics object at a certain moment, you just need to take the initial content and then apply all the operations until that moment, and then you will retrieve that logistics object at a certain revision. Okay, so that's it for the basic functions of the OneRecord API, and now we are going to get a little bit deeper into the subject and talk about the pub, sub, and delegation, and for that I'm going to leave the scene to Henk.
Thank you very much, Andra. Okay, so let's look at the pub, sub, and delegation. These are two very important aspects of OneRecord. The question is, how do I give data access to my partners? Okay, so this has to do with the delegation. So what does delegation mean? Let's say, for example, that a forwarder has shared some data with an airline. And the airline would like to be able to share that same data with one of their interline partners or their GHA, for example, one or the other. In principle, the way that OneRecord has been designed, that only the airline can actually get access to the forwarder data, because the forwarder has actually approved their access to that. So for the airline to be able to share the data with the interline partner, they have to do something special. Because if they would just give the URI to the interline partner or the GHA, if they were to try and get the data from the forwarder, which is on the forwarder server, they would be refused access, because there's no reason why they would be able to access it. So the airline has to do something. They have to do two things. First, they have to inform the interline partner what the URI is of the object that they would like them to have access to, but also they have to inform the original data owner, which is the forwarder in this case, that they would like to request access on behalf of the interline partner or the GHA, for example. If the forwarder grants access, then when the interline partner on GHA would actually access the information from the forwarder, they will be granted access. If, however, the forwarder decides not to grant the access, then the URI won't do anything, they won't be able to see access. So you can see how this, how you can, at this point, you can actually start providing access to third parties that may be unknown to the original party that has been publishing the data. This is an extremely important concept, because when you have a long chain of partners, it's not obvious that every partner downstream knows every other partner. Okay, so like this, we have a control process for asking access on behalf of a third party and then being granted that access. This goes one step further. And let's say, for example, that we have to go back to the original example. We have a forwarder that has shared data with an airline, and the airline has actually requested access to the interline partner in this case. Okay, great. What if the interline partner now wants to share this information with their GHA? Okay, on the other side perhaps. Now, that GHA may be completely unknown to the forwarder. So here's the deal. Since the forwarder has already trusted the interline partner can now request access on behalf of the GHA to the forwarder, right? To the initial party. In other words, the interline partner, who is now a trusted partner in this chain, can ask for access to that GHA. And assuming the forwarder grants the access, the GHA can now access the information. You can see how, like this, you can create a chain of trust. Each party that is trusted can request access on behalf to another party. That party, assuming it's trusted, can do the same thing again. So you can get a whole chain of trust set up. Okay, this is nice. But what if for some reason you need to revoke that trust? Now, you may not want to do that because you distrust people, but it may be that the party is no longer involved. For example, let's say that the airline has decided that they're not going to work with its interline partner again during the same shipment. They've actually found another party that needs to perform the shipment. In that case, the forwarder might decide to revoke the trust to that interline partner and then, by default, to any party downstream they have trusted. So it's all about managing the chain of trust and managing the access to this information. Okay, so the forwarder remains in control of the entire chain of trust, and they can decide who gets access and who cannot. How do we automate data notifications? Okay, again, an important aspect, because if you think about it, if you go back to the previous scenario, we have a whole chain of trust, everybody has access to the URI, but how do you know this information that you need to actually read and update on? So you don't want to have to go in every 5 minutes and see if there's a change, right? That's not how it works in the internet. So what we do here is we set up PubSub, publish and subscribe. So the way that works is that the original publisher, which in the previous example was the forwarder, they may say to the airline, say, hey, listen, I've got some information for you. Here's a URI. Would you like to subscribe to that? And the airline will say, yes, sure, I want to subscribe. Whenever you have updates, please send it to my callback URL. The publisher, which was the forwarder, takes note of the URL, and anytime there's a change that is meaningful, they will actually update on that callback endpoint. In other words, they will actually physically update the airline and say, hey, I've got some information for you, here it is. Now, if you remember the previous slides, we have a whole chain of trust. Of course, the same principle works for everybody. Every time somebody decides to request access for their partner, that partner can also subscribe to that information. In other words, the entire chain of trust can actually subscribe to this information as subscribers, and the publisher will notify anyone whose callback URL they are aware of. So in this way, the system is completely automatic. Nobody has to check for information. They will be notified. This is super important when you start getting complex networks. All right. So let's move on to the next topic, which is handling events. And this is going to be done by Andra.
Thank you, Henk. So yes, what if the consumer has some events related to the data of the logistics objects? For example, a departure of an aircraft that transports logistics objects, for example. So how does the consumer then send this kind of events to the publisher of the data? We do this in one record via what we call events. Events is kind of the same thing of status updates, but a little bit more. So for that, there is a dedicated end on which the client can send events logistics objects. It's kind of simple as that. It's just a post request containing event request body, and the server will then add it to the respective logistics object. There's nothing more to say about that. It's a very simple operation. Okay, so let's go to the next topic, which is the access control, which is a bit more complex, let's say. For that, we have used what we call the web access control. And then before getting into the details on how do we do it in one record, let's first find out what is web access control. Okay, so as a definition, web access control is a decentralized system for allowing different users and groups various forms of access to resources where users and groups are identified by HTTP URIs. Okay, so it is exactly what we need in one record, because in the Internet of Logistics, everyone is identified by HTTP URIs and all the resources the same way. Okay, so how can we apply this to one record? For that, we have defined what we call the access control list. This is something inspired by the web access control standard from W3C. It was not invented by us. We have reused their work on the subject. So in one record, accesses to resources can be done then using access control lists stored in the backend system of the one record servers. Each logistics object resource has a set of authorization statements describing who has access to that resource and what types or modes of access they have. So regarding who has access, it can be, for example, a company identifier, the URI of a client, for example, in the Internet of Logistics, or the one record server is free to define what we call a group. It can add, for example, multiple company identifiers and create an airline group, for example, meaning that all the airlines will be able to access that logistics object. This access control list defines in one record three modes. They are called read, write, and control. For the read, as it already says, it reads the content of logistics object and including querying it. It's mostly for the get endpoint. Then for the write, it's simply writing contents of the logistics object, which is via post and patch. And then from control, it's both read and write. Okay, I think that the web access control standard from W3C defines more modes, but in one record we decided that these three were sufficient for our scope. Okay, so in order to define this access control list, we suggest that the one record server implementers could use the ACL ontology for W3C. As it is an internal object for the server, it's not a mandatory feature. Let's say the servers can define their own access control list model if they wish, and they are not forced to decide to share this externally. But if they decide to share it, they should return it in a link header every time a GET request is performed on a logistics. Meaning that when I do a GET to retrieve logistics object, I get the response body containing all the information related to that logistics object, plus a link header which contains just this URL on which I can retrieve the access control list. And then on that, I could see what kind of users and groups can access what kind of information related to that logistics object. It's as simple as that. Okay, so then let's go to the next question, which is the versioning. Okay, on this matter, we have had several questions, and we have implemented a solution which is inspired by the Memento protocol. First of all, what is Memento protocol? I'm sure that you are asking yourself this question now. So the Memento protocol aims to bring time-based access to web resources using common web standards. Essentially, Memento is an attempt to permit users to view any web page as it looked on a given date in the past. This matched perfectly some of our questions, like, for example, how do I get the version of logistics object at a certain moment in time? First of all, what are the components of the Memento protocol? So Memento protocol has four main concepts. The original resource, which is basically the initial version of the logistics object, for example, is how the resource looked like when it was created. Then there is a memento, which is a snapshot of the data at a certain moment in time. There's a time gate. A time gate is a resource, is an endpoint on which can return based on a given date time. It can return the memento that is closest to that requested date, and there is a time map. The time map contains all the existing versions of logistics object, the original resource URL, and also the time gate. Okay, so let's go a bit deeper into the subject. So first question, how do I take a snapshot of the data? Of course, this snapshot can be taken by the OneRecord server itself when it wishes. It could be also taken by a client upon request on the server if there is such an agreement between the client and the server. This is quite free. But when this snapshot is taken, the server is creating what we call a memento. Okay, so memento is a web resource that is a prior version of the original resource that encapsulates what the original resource was like at some time in the past. In OneRecord, then a memento contains a snapshot of the data at a certain moment in time. Again, okay. It's as you can see on the diagram on the left, this memento can be retrieved both from the time map and the time map and the time gate. But I'm going to show you a bit later how that works exactly. Okay. Then the second question regarding the versioning was, how can I retrieve a version of the data at a certain moment in time? Okay, because for example, you would like to see how the data looked like yesterday at 3 p.m. Okay, so I would like to know which one of all the snapshots that exist related to logistics object is closest to 3 p.m. yesterday. Okay, so for that we have a time gate, and then this time gate decides on the basis of a given date which memento best matches what the original resource was like around that given date time. Okay, so for that you need to send an accept datetime header in the request on the time gate, and the time gate will return a link header in the response containing the memento URI that is closest to that date. Okay? And of course, it returns also the exact date of the creation of that memento. And the third question related to versioning is, how can I see all the existing versions of the data? For that, we Memento protocol defines time map, and also OneRecord implemented, which the time map contains the URI of the original resource, the URI of the time gate, and all the mementos that are associated with that original resource. Okay. In OneRecord, the time map is exposed via a link header when we are performing a GET request on the logistics object. So when you are doing a GET logistics object, you are going to retrieve the content of the logistics object plus the link header containing the access control list, as I was saying previously, and a link header containing the time map. Okay. So now let's get a bit more practical and see how that works actually in practice. For that, I'm going to share my screen. One moment. Okay. Already in the OneRecord team, we have developed a Java sandbox that basically implements all the needed endpoints of the OneRecord API. For the sake of simplicity, I have removed every security-related implementation for this demo, so it can be really simple. We were going to talk about security next week. So for now, I'm just going to show you all the endpoints that I have actually talked about. We have talked about during the presentation. So this Java sandbox basically uses the three ontologies, meaning the ontologies for cargo related models. It uses a second ontology which defines all the API related models, and then a third ontology which is the access control list ontology from W3C. Okay. So the sandbox it's based on these three ontologies. It generates all the Java models by using a framework called JOPA that I have presented a bit during the last webinar on crafting ontologies. It's called object triple mapping. Then it basically is just creating Java POJOs from RDF. Then this sandbox uses a Spring Boot framework and then a MongoDB database. Okay, so I'm just going to expand these endpoints quickly for you to have an idea of what are kind of the endpoints that are exposed in a OneRecord API. The endpoints that are called internal, they were created just for the purpose of this presentation to make it a bit clearer, but they are not exposed to all the clients. Okay, for example, creating a company, meaning that, for example, if I'm a OneRecord platform and I want to have several endpoints for different companies on my platform, for example, a forwarder, a shipper, an airline, etc. First, I need to create a dedicated identifier for that company. Okay, so it has then a company creation. I'm just going to go fast through this Swagger documentation, and then we are going to do clearer demo with Postman. Okay, then there is an endpoint that retrieves company identifier from the Internet of Logistics. So this is an endpoint that all the OneRecord servers kind of make available, and everyone can request, can retrieve the basic information of the company, meaning like the server endpoints, what types of logistics objects if it supports, etc. Then there is an endpoint for the subscribers, which are also internal, meaning that every time then, for example, a client wants to subscribe to some type of logistics object, then this server will create an internal subscriber database in order to then notify the subscribers every time there is a new logistics object that might interest them. Then there's a delegation resource on which clients can request delegation of access or revocation of access to third parties. And then there are logistics objects endpoints, which is one for the creation, the one with post that Henk talked about. Then there's the get, the patch. And then there will be an ACL for the access control list, which is not mandatory to be made available. There's an audit trail one for the retrieval of the history of the logistics object. And there are two endpoints for the events, for the creation and for the retrieval. Okay. Then regarding the callback, it's the endpoint on which the server receives notifications from publisher in a scenario where this server is the subscriber. It works in a sort like as a webhook. So usually the people who are willing to implement this kind of notification endpoint, they should maybe implement a sort of queuing and in order to handle all the notifications. But this is a bit outside of the OneRecord scope. Everyone can implement the webhook the way they wish, of course. And then there's the versioning resource for the creation of the snapshots of the mementos. I have marked it with internal because in this case, only the server can create snapshots of data. It's not made available for the client to do so. And then there are endpoints for the retrieval of the snapshot, the retrieval of the time gate, which of course has a daytime request parameter, and then a time map. I'm not going to go too much in detail to this Swagger, but you can download the Java sandbox that is on our GitHub, and you can run it just locally. It should work out of the box, and you will have this kind of interface for you to see how models looks like. For example, you'll have example and all kinds of fields that are available. Okay. But in order to continue the demo, I'm going to show you a Postman scenario. One moment. Okay. So in order to make this simpler for testing, we have created Postman collection. Okay, it contains all the existing endpoints of the API together with example request JSON LD for you to kind of be able to test it out of the box. The Swagger is nice, but the Swagger does not provide you with a real example. It provides you with generic examples of the models. So we found that Postman, it was a bit simpler for those who really want to just test it out of the box. Okay, this sandbox, Postman collection is available in the Java GitHub repository. So if you download the code from there, you will also have this collection together. Okay, so it's very, you will just need to import it in your Postman and it will just work. Okay. Okay, so let's try to have a small scenario of how this would work. First of all, we should create what we call the company identifier. Assuming that this server, it's a platform, it has many company identifiers, that many companies that that host their data on that platform. So for this example, let's take company ID that we called webinar, for example. What is the company information that needs to be posted? Is the company ID, then basic information about the company like airline code, if it's an airline, or branch, address, contact person. I have already filled this with some dummy data, so we don't waste time of it, but you can go deeper into this model on your own computer afterwards if you feel like. And then also the server endpoint, which in this case will be the URL of the endpoint. In my case, it's localhost because I'm running this server locally, and then companies, and then webinar. Okay, so and then it contains also what kind of supported logistics objects the server supports. You might wonder yourself why why the field names are in this format. I'm reminding you that we are working with JSON link data. It's not real JSON. Actually, it's JSON plus extra information, which is the vocabulary that we are using. Basically, each field contains the link to the one record ontology. Okay, so when you go to one record ontology, you'll be able to get the description of what every field means. So now let's first create this company. Okay, it worked fine. You can see that status it's 201 created. So now if we get a company by ID, let's say webinar, it should return all the information. It's there, it's created. Okay. For example, if a publisher wants to ask the server if it wants to subscribe to some sort of logistics object, then it will send that request on an endpoint called, or on the company like identifier, which is again company's webinar, and with a topic, meaning that what kind of logistics object it wants to share. For example, let's put peace. Okay, so if the publisher sends a post, a GET request on this URL, then this server will reply with its subscription information if it wants to subscribe. For this scenario, the server will want to subscribe. So basically, what it sends, it's a subscription model. Okay, this subscription model is defined in our API model ontology. It was the fields inside are defined by the One Record API and Security Working Group. So basically what this subscription contains, it means like, hey, this is my callback URL. So meaning that if the publisher has notification, it needs to send it here. It contains the topic URL, for example, this is the type of piece from the One Record ontology, my company identifier, and other sorts of information. For example, the send of logistics object body true or false. It means that when there is a notification about the logistics object, send me just the ID of it, and I'm going to do a get afterwards to retrieve the whole information, or send me the whole body because I don't want to do an extra get, for example, for like performance reasons maybe. So this is what a subscription contains. Okay, then on the other, if we continue, so if we take this this URL of the notification, and then we kind of assume that a publisher wants to send a notification, says, hey, now that you are subscribed to me, I have something that might interest you. I have a piece of information that interests you. Then I'm going to, then it's going to send a notification on this callback webhook endpoint. The notification contains, it's really simple. It contains an event type, which is object created or updated. It contains logistics object reference, which in this case, well, it's some ID. And then it contains the topic, okay? For this, it was a bit difficult to really showcase you this because it's, well, if there are two servers communicating, and it's not very easy to see that with Postman, but you would assume that there is now a publisher server that sends this request, okay? So then this is kind of a notification for a new created object, okay? So what are the other endpoints? There's an endpoint for the delegation. So if a server wants to delegate access to a third server to some logistic object, it will send to this delegation endpoint a delegation request, which contains an action, which is delegate or revoke. It contains the operations of the delegation, which can be a get and patch, meaning that I would like a third company to retrieve the content logistics object or update it. Then the target company, this would be like which is the third party company that would like that access, and then the target logistics object, meaning the URI of the logistics object on which we want to have access, okay? I'm not going to send it, it's just going to create a delegation, but well, on the back end, let's say that it will just give, it will add an extra access control list element for this target company that will give read access to this logistics object. Okay, I hope that you are following me. It's a bit, it might be a lot of information for the newbies, but then you can listen to this webinar if you get lost in between. Okay, so then let's go to the logistics objects related operations. I'm just going to to close a bit the windows because there are too many and I get lost myself. Okay, so for the post logistics object, again, there is a dedicated endpoint for that with the company identifier /LOs. It takes the content type JSON LD, and the body should be a logistics object. For this, I have pre-created piece logistics object. I'm just going to change the company identifier, which is webinar, and then, well, inside it has all sorts of information, also some dummy data like dimensions, document ID, it's like webinar, whatever, all sorts of information. So if we create this logistics object, we can see that what happens then. We have the status 201 created. It returns a location header that contains the URL of this newly created logistics object, okay? So now if we do a get on that URI that we just created, it should return. You can see that now it has an ID. The ID will always be the URL on which we can do a get request and to retrieve it, and it can contain the same data. But as another thing is the headers that we need to check. We can see that in the headers, we have a header for the access control list and a header for the time map, okay? So already we can access those to see, for example, if we do a time map, sorry, example, it will return, well, for now in the time map, we don't have a lot of things because it has just the original resource and the time gate. The time gate, as I was already explaining earlier, it's an endpoint on which you send a date, and it will return you the version that is closest to that date. Okay. What else can we do? Okay, we have also the access control one. CL. On that, it returns a list of authorization. Yeah, I think that it gives for this. Yeah, it's a dummy one. It just says that basically it just gives access to this server to all the operations on this. It doesn't do anything really special, but of course this can be changed to add more write-read authorizations. Then we can also post events. I'm just going to change it again. For that, we send what we call an event. An event, it's another object that is defined in our one record ontology that you can find also on GitHub. Then let's say that there is an event which is arrival at Geneva office. It's again some dummy data, but then post request it will create this event related to the logistics object. So now if we do a get on that piece, it will contain, sorry. Sorry, I was like, what is the piece? I'm not scrolling enough. Okay, so now we can see that in this piece, it will have also an event, this event that was associated to it, okay? Yes, if we want to create a memento, the same, we just post memento. I have already pre-filled a request, let's say version 1, and then the URL on which we apply this memento. Maybe seen like this, for many of you, this might not mean anything, but when you are going to implement your server, you're going to realize that actually these are all the operations that you need to be like kind of one record compliant. So this memento was created. It returns in the header a location of that memento, okay? So now if you just do a get on that, you will receive the first memento, the first snapshot. For now, it just has it has the original one. It was not, there were no like different changes. It contains only the original. Also, if we do now a time map on that object, you are going to see that, you'll see that memento inside, which is a snapshot of the data at that moment in time. And yeah, I think that I've already bored you maybe with all these endpoints, but what I kind of suggest is that you download the sandbox and run it locally and try to play a bit with it. Take a look at the models, take a look at what they contain. They might look a bit like complicated seen from like this with the with all these ontology related elements, but they are quite simple and they are quite like straightforward to implement. Okay. Okay. So if I go back to my presentation. Okay. If you what if you want to like if you want to know more about this? So first of all, take a look at the OneRecord API and security specifications. You can find the link in this presentation afterwards. Take a look of the ontology of the API models if you want to have an idea of what these models look like. Also, there's the ontology for the data model related to cargo that you can download on GitHub. Also, we have provided JSON LD examples and this Postman collection. Everything is on GitHub, so please take a look at that. Again, there's this Swagger interface that kind of shows you a bit how the models look like. And then we are preparing a series of 3 white papers. The first one is already out. It's on the data model. The second one will be related exactly to the topic that we are talking today during the webinar, which is the API. And then will be a third one on security in the fall. Okay, so also if you want to advance your knowledge and skills, please join our next webinars. There's 2 more left on security on pilots every Tuesday from 11 to 12:30 Central Europe time. Then there's an online hackathon mid-September and also the Digital Cargo Conference in September. Okay, and if you have any other questions, you can write us. And with that, let's go to question and answers. Okay.
Okay, Q&A.
Yes.
Right, so, but before we go there, I want to step back a little bit. I was watching you show this stuff, and obviously you know what you're doing. If I hadn't seen this, I would have been maybe blown away by all the stuff that you were showing there. But it isn't as complex as that. I mean, when you show this in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, it does look like a lot. But if you actually want to implement this, it turns out that it is not as hard as all that. And you have to remember what we're doing here. We are actually talking about data sharing within the logistics and transport industry. This is not a trivial thing, you know. If you remember, your company has invested many years trying to get the messaging world to work. Now we're transiting to data sharing. And in the same way that when you've been building websites many years ago, perhaps, you had to do a lot of this stuff as well. It's just now we're doing it for data. Okay, so a lot of these additional features like the memento, the versioning, the pub/sub, delegation, once you really start thinking about it, you need that, okay? It's not enough just to post something and to get it. So you'll find that when you look into this, you need it, and guess what? The specifications are there, including examples, okay? So let's maybe get into the Q&A. Lots of questions. We can take one after the other, or okay. If you think, oh, this is my question, I'll take it, you take it. Okay, so let's start with the first one. I'll read it out, and then we can decide who answers it. Would the access be requested and granted as part of a booking confirmation and acknowledgement with the forwarder? I'm going to repeat that. Okay. Would the access be requested and granted as part of the booking confirmation and acknowledgement with the forwarder? I will take that one. Short answer is yes. When a forwarder makes a booking with an airline, then clearly both parties agree on the transport, on the details of the transport and everything, and therefore they will obviously provide each other access to any relevant information. The airline would provide access to their booking, the forwarder would provide access to the airway bill, etc. Of course, behind the scenes they have to do that. It's not automatic, but if a forwarder makes a booking and the airline requests access to, for example, an airway bill, obviously the forwarder will give access to the airline. So the grant will be implicit, but they still need to do the action behind the scenes. Okay, so, but from a business perspective, yes, that's what would have to happen. Okay?
Okay, I'll take the next one. How can I implement the OneRecord API? Are they available online? I only see the specifications on GitHub. So if you want to implement the OneRecord API, you can already download the specifications, take a look at them, and then get some developers to implement them on your local servers, or you can use our Java sandbox to have it as a starting point, and then you can build on that and build more features depending on what you are needing. Okay, so there's there's no, let's say, correct way of implementing a One Record API. You can use what we provide. You can use your own infrastructure and developers. But you just need to follow the One Record specification so that you can be compliant with the other One Record APIs from the Internet of Logistics.
And I recommend you do exactly that. It's a great exercise. If you haven't deployed servers before, then you're going to have a lot of fun doing this. If you have, it's trivial. Okay, whether you do it local or on some server you have or whatever, but it's really the best way to learn anything about the API is to implement it, and you'll quickly find out that everything you've heard today just makes sense once you do that. Okay, so next one. How many? Sorry, I'm skipping one here, perhaps. How are these APIs related to airline APIs, such as, for example, in distribution like rates, quotes, and bookings? Okay, that's a good question. There are many APIs out there already. Maybe not as many as we would like to see, but there are many APIs out there. Many companies have indeed implemented rates, quotes, and booking APIs, tracking, tracing, you name it, and they're all different. I think one of the efforts, and one of the reasons we have developed the One Record data sharing approach, and we have been specifying an API together with the industry, is to make sure that they are the same APIs, okay? So that once we start using the standard One Record API, then no matter which company you go to for a quote or a rate or a track or a trace or whatever, you'll be using exactly the same API signature, okay? Which means that your system that is, for example, doing a GET, will do exactly the same GET with one airline or another, or one forwarder or another, okay? So that's the whole point of One Record. Now, in the meantime, APIs are out there and they will not be exactly the same. So my guess is that many companies implementing One Record will actually keep their existing APIs as well as a One Record API. They will give the same data in response, but for backward compatibility, they will then use probably both implementations. But certainly the future is using the same APIs, which will be the One Record API. Okay.
Thanks. How many airlines have already implemented this API? I don't have the exact number of airlines, but we are currently working with around 50 companies from our One Record pilots, and this number is constantly growing. So there are quite a lot of them that are implementing and testing One Record standard at the moment. But I don't have the exact number of airlines specifically. You can take a look. I think that in our first webinar, we have presented a slide with all the involved companies. So if you really want to know the exact number, you can take a look on that presentation and see how many of them there are.
Okay. The next question, I'll take the next two questions, because the next question is actually very similar to the one you just answered. And the question is there a list of One Record API compatible participants? Again, same answer. Currently, we're working with pilot companies. I think we have about 50 or so that are various stages of implementation. Some of them have fully implemented, some are in the process. And so we're really very much at that point where people are experimenting, which is what I encourage you to do as well, is to participate in a pilot, deploy your own servers, or share a server with another party and sort of get going with that. But it's really, we're at the beginning of a big thing. Many companies are working with this, and therefore, if you wanted to exchange data with another partner, another participant, they're out there, and you'd find them if you were looking at our One Record pilot environment, okay, pilot program. So I'm going to take the next one as well then, otherwise you get too many questions and I don't. Do you plan to do a certification program like NDC certification program? I think NDC is what they have on the passenger side,
a
correct?
New distribution capability.
Correct, yes, indeed. Yes, sort of, okay. The One Record specification is very, very specific, which is why it's specification. And it's ultimately also a standard. So therefore, if you actually want to use One Record APIs and data models, etc., you have to implement it correctly. Because if you don't, then you cannot exchange data, right? If someone else implements the APIs a bit differently from you, then you will not be able to interact. So one of the things that we are planning to implement is not so much a certification, but an automatic audit. In other words, we want to have a server running somewhere where you can connect to and start doing data exchanges with this reference server. And then you can test whether all of your API features have been implemented correctly, whether your data model has been implemented correctly. In other words, you could completely automate the check that you have done this correctly. Now, we may or may not decide to provide you with certificates that says, okay, I've done the check. Maybe it's an automatic check that you go there, you check it, and the thing will say to you, okay, your API works fine for Memento, works fine for PubSub, but the delegation has some work to do still. Something like that. You get an audit report. But yes, we plan to automate it because really, the internal logistics will have thousands of nodes, 10,000s of nodes, maybe even hundreds of thousands of millions when you start looking at all the shippers in other parts that may want to participate in this. So we nearly have to automate also audits and certifications. So yes, very much part of our plan.
Okay, thanks. And the next one, is there automatic reciprocity between the new partners to promote sharing of the data? Assumption is that the new partner also have a one record server if they request access to an object from a partner. In one record, we have what we call a data access policy. It's just like a private contract between partners when they start kind of doing business together. I think it's every partner decides what kind of data access they give to the other partners. It's not, we don't define automatic reciprocity. This is up to the servers and the entities to decide to whom they give access. And of course, there's a delegation endpoint if one of the partners want to give access to a third party. So we have provided the endpoints for all sorts of data access, but we don't define like automatic reciprocity sort of principle yet. It is up to the partners to do so if they wish.
Okay, thank you. Next two questions are about relate to XML and Cargo Imp, so I'll take them together as well. The first question is, how can the API work together with the current Imp and Cargo Imp and Cargo XML messages? And the next question is, what's the difference between the API and the Cargo XML messages? Okay, so I don't know the exact numbers, but my guess is that 99% of the industry is using Cargo Imp and Cargo XML for data exchange. Okay, so that's very much what is out there. How can we use this together with a one record API? Now, a few different scenarios. Let's say that you're using a CCS or some message provider that allows you currently to exchange information using Cargo Imp and or Cargo XML, right? It's there. What if that CCS implement one record? Well, if they do, then they could provide a direct API access to your data, which you're currently receiving through Imp and XML. Okay, so in a sense, whoever is hosting your messaging system could make a bridge between the messaging world and the one record world and provide you with an API. Now, what does that mean? It would mean that all of your partners could simply connect to whatever URI is being created for their data and start interacting through your message service provider or your CCS using one record. Okay, so you would actually be able then to start sharing URIs with the world, with your business partners, even though you yourself have not implemented it. Similarly, if you did implement it yourself, you can create your own bridge as well. Because if you think about it, all we're talking about is how you expose your data to the world. You could either have a messaging interface, in which case you and your partners are exchanging messaging, but ultimately it's your back-end data that you're sharing through messages. You can do the same thing using an API. So I think during the transition, and I don't know how long it's going to last, but knowing this industry will last a few years at least, you will either get data through messaging and then maybe share it through a one record API, or to be backward compatible, you get data in through one record APIs and share it through messaging world. So it's very much somebody needs to make the connection, either yourself or your service providers. Okay.
Thanks. In a live use case, do you expect the access control list delegation request to be configured for each logistics object, or do you envisage the chain of trust to be established between stakeholders beforehand? This is a very good question. As I was saying while I was presenting access control list, it's not a mandatory feature. I think it's just a way to make, to have like the visibility on who has access to what kind of modes on a logistics object, that it's easier for the owner of the logistics object. It can be like this kind of access can be defined beforehand, of course, in a sort of contract, or it can be stored somewhere in a database, like, or on the back end to say like this person has access to that sort of logistics object. But we think that an access control list, it's more transparent, and it will contain exactly the list of groups and the entities who can read or patch or do all sorts of operations on logistics objects. We also think that, for example, if I'm a client and I don't know anymore what kind of rights I have on a logistics object, if I didn't save it in my backend, for example, I can just do a request on the ACL endpoint, and I would instantly know what kind of rights I have. Can I get? Can I patch? So I don't have to like be surprised if I suddenly cannot get any more information about the logistics objects, for example. So it's not. It can be done in other ways. These sorts of saving who has access to what, but we think that ACL it's just a simpler way, and if everybody implements it, then it will make your things clearer and more transparent, like to know who has access what at any point in time.
I agree. Very important. Okay, next one. That's an interesting question. Is IATA planning to offer a one record platform in a software as a service mode to the industry? It's an interesting question because we were just talking about that earlier this week, as in yesterday. We thought about that a few years ago when we first started speccing out the IATA, sort of the one record API and data model and stuff like that. We said, oh, what if somebody wants to deploy this as a service? Okay, do we need to specify how they do that as well? And we actually started including that as specifications. Then we said, no, that's the wrong approach. If somebody wants to do that, they can do it any way they want it. Okay, so that discussion we had 2-3 years ago. We then found out that there were a number of companies that were actually planning to do exactly this, and they were actually deploying platforms where if you didn't want to implement your own one record server, you could actually use their services. Now, they were actually planning to deploy this in 2020. And some companies had actually had plans to get it out there and to start providing services, of course, at a cost, you know, that you could, instead of implementing your own, you could buy their services and have on record as a service. And then COVID happened, COVID-19, just at the time when these companies were deploying this stuff. And of course, as you know, the industry took a massive hit in terms of efficiency, in terms of cost, in terms of revenues. And although on the cargo side, things are still looking good, overall, the industry is taking a massive hit. So we have seen a bit of a slowdown in these AAS services. So we were talking about whether or not we, IATA, should be deploying something like that, just to accelerate the implementation. And so we're considering it. In a sense, you know, all the stuff that Andra was showing you, you can download it in GitHub and deploy it. So what we're talking about is, should we download it ourselves, put it on a server, and then make it available to you? We have a sandbox, so in a sense we've done it already, but to actually do this on a production level. We're considering it. If we do it, it's not because we think we should be deploying a service like that, but because we think we might allow companies to accelerate the implementation whilst they get working their way through this crisis. When they're back up on their feet again and when the IT budgets begin to flow again, we would actually prefer that companies implement their own and that service providers, and there's many of them in the industry, would do exactly the same things. We don't want to be a major player, but if it helps to advance the project, we will do that.
Okay, next question. Is there any specific training available from IATA on the API technology? Yes, this webinar. Already, if you want to start with something, you can already, I think you can rewatch it and share it with your teams. I think it's a very good starting point with what is the One Record API. You can also watch the other webinars. We have, of course, the API documentation, but we don't have a training per se related to the API. But I think that we have already a lot of material. We have the One Record Insights, the white papers. There's so much information out there related to this project that I'm sure that if you want to start with that, there's a lot of things to learn already from the existing sources.
And maybe just to add to that, when we started the year, before COVID broke out, we had plans to actually develop a training program as well. The reason we're doing these webinars, in a sense, is to be able to do this training, to share this information. I think down the road, once dust has settled, we'll most likely will go back to the original day as to develop a training as well, so that you could enroll and then probably get sessions just like this, but in a training format, but it will be very simple, okay? So we're definitely planning to do something along those lines. Okay, next question. Is it possible to get a demo with a real-like scenario that starts with booking all the way to delivery of cargo in consignee? Is it possible? Absolutely, it's possible. And one of the things that we are working on at the moment is to implement that, okay? So we have lots of things that we had on our plans this year. I mentioned training, we're thinking about some consulting. We wanted to do a lot of documentation, which we have done. It's all available online. We're doing the webinars, etc., etc. Another thing that we're working on, which is coming along beautifully, is actually we're working on a developer portal. A developer portal which has all of the information, which of course will have also the access to the GitHub, it will have the sandbox, it will have great tools for exploring the ontology, and basically a one-stop shop. If you want to learn about One Record, if you want to implement it, this is where we'll go. That is one thing we're working on. The next thing is to do exactly that thing, is to have an environment, a demo environment, where you could go and indeed see what happens all the way from a booking request to delivery of the consignee. We're actually implementing that. It requires us to have multiple parties implemented on multiple servers and then present it in a way that actually makes sense. So hold your patience, as we're going to say. We're working on that. That will be available, I don't know, a few months, something like that. Yeah, it's definitely by about the autumn, we should have something like that up and running, because we need it ourselves as well, because we get a lot of questions. Okay, how does it work? We understand, you know, the theory, but how does it work in practice? So very important thing that we want to deliver this year.
And we have already all the tools. We have the ontology viewer, the Swagger, we have the Postman, we have everything. We just need to put them all together and then also develop some sort of demo front end to kind of put a face on what I have shown you earlier in Postman, like to have something maybe simpler, because that was really technical. So just put some sort of front end on top of it to make it a little bit clearer from for people that are not so technical. Yeah. Okay. Today are the Java Sandbox and the JavaScript Sandbox feature equivalent, and will they both be maintained? So no, they are not feature equivalent. The JavaScript Sandbox, it was not updated since maybe September last year. I have insisted on the Java Sandbox because it works more nicely with object triple mapping, for example, as it is an object-oriented programming language. I found that it was really easy to transform ontologies into models and then save it to a database, which in JavaScript was a mess. So as our ontologies are like really huge and the models are really complex, I felt that Java was the language to kind of invest in, and maybe also Python or other sort of like object-oriented languages in the future. But for JavaScript, it was a bit more difficult. But of course, it's on GitHub. It's a public repository. So if somebody wants to kind of contribute also on it and to add code to it, please do so. It's there to be contributed. We are all a community, so of course we will be more than happy to have other kind of developers contributing to that. But for now, it's not a priority. Maybe in the future, if we have more demands related to that, but not for now.
And the history of this thing is that initially, when we started One Record, we organized a hackathon. And actually, we needed we decided to do a hackathon in 2 months' time. And Arno is sitting here next to me. He's part of the production team. And incidentally, a shout out to Arno and Isaac, who are doing a great job producing this stuff every week. And we had 2 months to prepare it. So we very quickly implemented the JavaScript server, which I did myself with some help from other people. But it was sort of very quick and dirty. Then we hired a professional, this person here, who then upgraded it in such a way that it actually started working more or less correctly. But then we realized in speaking with the people that were implementing One Record, they much prefer to work with environments like Java and .NET. So Andra then ported the whole thing to Java, which is now being maintained and it's fully up to scratch. It's fully in line with our specification. As you say, this should be a community effort. I think in time we will see improvements on all sides. But I don't know what we should do with it, whether we should stimulate working on that, whether we should put a little note on it, this is not entirely up to date or something, but it'd be a shame to lose it, right? Because there's a lot of good stuff in there.
It's on my kind of to-do list to upgrade it actually, but I didn't, it's another priority for now. But I think that it will be done at some point.
One day we'll have open source versions for everything, okay?
It will be really nice.
All right, next one. Oh, Rudy. Hi, Rudy. Is it right to state that the GHA can grant access to the local public authorities? Question mark. Is One Record limited to our bill, house bill? For example, what about certificate of origins? Okay, excellent questions. Firstly, yes, absolutely, Rudy. The GHA can grant access to the local public authorities. Now, when we say grant access, we have to remember what the delegation was all about. If, for example, the forwarder is hosting data and have given access to the GHA, then the GHA can indeed request that the forwarder gives access to the local authorities. And in nearly all cases, the forwarder will grant that access. They have to, because if they didn't and the authorities don't get access to the data, guess what? The authorities are probably not going to approve whatever it is they have to approve. So this is really about how the different parties in the supply chain work together, okay? The forwarder should really grant any such request. If an authority wants data, and the GHA in this case says to the forwarder or the airline or the shipper, hey, you need to grant access, they must do that. If they don't, they're in trouble. Okay. So the first one is yes, they will do that. Secondly, is One Record limited to arable house bill origin of certificate of origin? No, not at all. It's not limited on that. And in fact, One Record is very much data focused, data centric. Okay, the data that is being shared is really used for all sorts of purposes. And I'll give you a very simple example. The shipper and the forwarder, the shipper and the consignee, the shipper address, the shipper details, consignee details, etc. On virtually every document that you can imagine, including house bill, ABBA bill, certificate of origin, these two parties are mentioned. Okay, One Record is focusing on the actual data. Now, how do you use the data? You might use it in a document and you might use it somewhere else. So one of the concepts we've often talked about in One Record is that documents, I should quote this, documents as an output. What does that mean? We have the data. If we want to create an ABBA bill from the data, or a house bill from the data, or a certificate of origin from the data, or any other type of document, we can, as long as we have the data. Right? So if we have the data, we can create certificate of origin. So what we're actually sharing is the data. Now, in practice, people want to see documents, right? You were talking about authorities a minute ago. They want to see a document. Fine. We'll create maybe a URI that represents a house bill or an ABBA bill or a certificate of origin or whatever it is. That URI will then go inside and find the data that it needs to populate the document. Okay? And that's all there's to it. So it's not limited at all. It is, in fact, far more than that, including documents and data things that haven't been invented yet. It's all One Record compliant, compatible. Okay?
Okay. Once One Record is embraced by the industry, is there still a need for cargo XML? I will leave Henk answer this question, please. Henk.
Once One Record is embraced by the industry, well, it's the embraced by the industry, I think, that we need to look at. If we go back in time, XML was started at least 10 years ago. Cargo Imp is 30 or so years old, if not more. eABBA bill, which exists in both formats, it goes back at least 50 years, probably 20 or even 25 years, if we go back to the earlier stages. So what does embraced by the industry mean? If it means 100% is using One Record, then by implication, 0% will be using something else. Okay, so that would answer your question. However, in practice, maybe 5% or 10% or 50% or 90% is using one record, and therefore there will always be parties using some of the legacy formats like cargo imp and cargo XML. And guess what? Let's say that in 10 years' time, which in this industry doesn't seem so long, everybody's using one record. By then, we'll have invented something new. Because maybe we're using quantum computers, or maybe we actually have decided that blockchain is much, much better than we thought it was, and we're sort of switching towards the blockchain type technologies, etc. Okay, so there's always going to be more than one, and therefore we will always need to have compatibility between legacy and future data formats. Okay, so that's a reality. I'm mindful of the clock. It's 12:27. I think we can do one or two more questions, and then we'll have to wrap this one up. So you want to do the next one?
Yes, I think it's more related to coding.
Okay.
How does it map the field name of logistics object elements, URI in IATA ontologies, to properties of POJO? And is there any tool to do the same that mapping for C# object? This is a good question. It's like in our Java sandbox, we are using the Java framework to map the ontologies to POJOs. Actually, as these ontologies are really, really huge files, and we contain like many classes, many properties. So if you have to do that manually to maintain it, it's like almost impossible. So likely there are some tools out there that kind of directly generate Java POJOs starting from an ontologies. And these POJOs contain the ID field, which is the URI of that object, contains the type and the context, which are kind of the three elements of linked data in the JSON LD. And regarding the fact that is there any tool for that in C#, I don't know. I have had that question, I think, that last webinar also. Yeah. So maybe there's a need for that. I need to check. I haven't checked yet. There might be. But I've seen for Java and for Python, for C++, but not for C#. So maybe we should invent it if it's not there yet.
Let me apologize on behalf of Andra, who got the question last week and hasn't spent the whole week researching it.
I'm sorry.
But anyway, no, kidding you. No, it's a good question, and it's definitely one of those things we want to look into. All right, last question. Actually, it's a follow-up question on the question of Rudy, but this one is by Dennis. Can providers share access to PDF versions of documents instead of data? Good question. How shall I answer that? One Record is about data sharing. It's not about document sharing. One Record is about recognizing that the data that we need is inside the documents. It's not the documents themselves that are the data. Why do I say that? We have suffered a lot from data quality issues whereby you take the entire stack of documentation that goes with a shipment, and I've seen numbers of 35 documents per shipment, okay, of all the different types. You put all of these documents together, and what you discover is that almost without exception, not all the data in all the documents is the same. It may be content-wise the same. It may be even factually the same. But what you're going to see is that one document has more space for the address than the other documents. And therefore, some of the address may be cut off. Or they might have to shorten it. And that is if everything goes well. The other possibility is that the documents were created by different parties who may not think that certain information is important and hasn't actually copied it correctly, made errors, but for them it didn't matter. So the whole problem we're trying to address with data sharing is to get away from some of these quality issues that we've seen in documents. So, coming back to the question, could we share PDF versions of documents instead of data? Technically, yes, of course. You could put a PDF document on a server. You could even put it on a One Record server, create a URI, and share that URI with any parties. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. I can't stop you. Andra won't stop you. The production team here won't stop you. But is it a good idea? I don't think so. I think that if you want to share PDF, by all means do it, but don't use One Record for that. Because One Record is all about guaranteeing the quality of data, being able to control the access to certain elements of data. all of the stuff you hear about here today is data-centric. Technically, yes. Is it a good idea? I don't think so. I think it would be a much smarter idea to take the information that's inside the PDF and publish it within one of our ontologies. Now, there's no time for a follow-up question, but if you had a follow-up question, you might say, yes, that's all very well, but I have a PDF document for which there is no ontology, for which the electronic data doesn't exist. I know. If that wasn't the case, if you didn't have that problem, then we would have solved electronic data exchange within freight many, many years ago, but that problem does exist. So I would encourage you, not just you, Dennis, but everyone else, if you have PDFs that have important information that needs to be shared, let's discuss how we can create an ontology for that, and let's share the data behind the PDF rather than the PDF itself. Okay, so with that little bit of preaching and promotion and motivational speech, I want to thank you very much. We had quite a good attendance today. I'm really impressed. Thank you very much for staying all the way. I really enjoyed it. Andra really enjoyed it. I can see it on Smiley Face. The production team enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed it too. Join us next week at the same time, 11 o'clock in CE, what is it? Central European summertime, yeah. You know, don't forget the S. We're going to be talking about data security. Super important aspect. We talked about access today, but security is a whole different ballgame. Going to be very interesting. We have another company helping us also out with this. We've been developing some security solutions for us, and I look forward to being there with you. And Andra is going to be speaking again next week. Maybe myself, I don't know yet, I haven't decided, but I'm competent. But between now and then, we'll figure that one out. So thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch break, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.